The message arrived at 0300 Council Standard Time, which meant almost no one was awake to read it, which was exactly when humanity had chosen to send it. It was 3 lines long. It contained no threats, no demands, and no signature beyond a registry code. Counselor Batharan OSS, the presiding officer of the Trade and Client Affairs Subcommittee, found it waiting in her queue the next morning between a tariff dispute and a request for translated menus, and she almost filed it under administrative housekeeping before she actually read the words. Notice of withdrawal. Client species designation HU. 1. Humanity. Effective immediate. All contracts, postings, and standing arrangements terminated as of transmission. No further correspondence will be answered at this address. She read it twice. Then she laughed once and forwarded it to the full subcommittee with a note that said, essentially, good riddance, and went to get her second cup of exuberant. That was the last time anyone on the council found the situation funny. For days before the notice went out, on a listening post designated Rim Station 9, a woman named Dana Okafor packed 11 years of her life into 2 crates and did not look back at the console she'd been sitting at since she was 26. The post was a squat pressurized hull bolted to an asteroid nobody had bothered to name, 3 weeks from the nearest inhabited system by courier drone, and effectively silent the rest of the time. She'd taken the posting because it paid enough to clear her family's debts, and because nobody else had wanted it badly enough to outbid her for the contract. In 11 years, she had learned to read the background noise of that stretch of the rim the way other people read, whether the ordinary drift of cosmic static, the occasional pirate chatter, and underneath all of it, so faint it took years to even notice, a pattern that didn't belong to anything cataloged. She had never been able to prove what it was. She had only ever been able to prove that it was there, and that over the years it had been getting very slowly less faint. She'd filed reports about it for a decade. 9 of them had gone entirely unanswered. The 10th had gotten a form letter thanking her for her diligence and noting that the matter had been referred to Council Science Division for review at the next available opportunity, a phrase she'd come to understand meant never. She left a final entry in the post's log before the shuttle came for her, not because anyone had asked her to, and not because she expected anyone to read it soon. Signal pattern continuing prior trend, increasing frequency. Still not matching any registered profile. Recommend continued monitoring by qualified personnel. This post will be unstaffed as of today. I'm sorry. I did what I could with what they gave me to work with. She sealed the post behind her, boarded the shuttle, and did not think about it again for 6 days, which was exactly as long as it took for the silence to start meaning something. To understand why nobody panicked, you first had to understand what the Council thought humanity was. Humanity had joined Galactic Society 41 years earlier, discovered not by grand first contact, but by a bored listening post technician who picked up decades of leaked broadcast signal drifting past a dead relay station, and spent 4 months trying to convince his superiors that the signal wasn't a malfunction. When contact was finally made, the newcomers were, by every metric the Council used to rank species, unimpressive. No unified government. No standardized currency. A culture that seemed to consist mostly of contradicting itself. They fought wars with each other well into their era of interstellar contact, which every serious civilization found faintly embarrassing, the way you might find it embarrassing to watch a grown man still sucking his thumb. The Council admitted them as a client species, a tier below full membership, granted trade access and diplomatic recognition, but no vote, no seat, no say in anything that mattered. It was, by Council standards, a generous offer. Client species usually spent a century or 2 proving themselves before anyone even considered a promotion, and the fact that humanity was offered client status at all, rather than being quarantined for further study like several other newly discovered species had been, was treated in Council press releases at the time as an act of considerable magnanimity. Humanity accepted the terms without complaint, which the Council took as evidence of good sense finally arriving. Diplomatic cables from that period, the ones Batharan would later pull and reread with a very different eye, described the human delegation as cooperative, pragmatic, and refreshingly unconcerned with status, which had been intended as a compliment, and which nobody at the time thought to read any other way. What the Council did not do in the 41 years that followed was ask what humanity was actually doing with its time. If they had asked, they would have learned that human shipping consortiums had become the largest single carrier of cargo along the Keswick Expanse, not because anyone had planned it that way, but because the routes through the expanse were long, cold, and boring, and every other species with the technical capability to run them had better things to do with their fleets. They would have learned that the backwater listening outposts scattered along the rim, the ones the Council funded at the absolute minimum required by treaty and mostly forgot existed, were staffed almost entirely by human contractors, because the postings were remote, low status, and paid poorly by Council standards, and humans kept applying for them anyway. They would have learned that when a plague broke out on the mining colony of Threnbell 4 years prior, and the Council spent 6 weeks in committee debating whose jurisdiction the outbreak fell under, it was a human medical retrieval team that flew in without authorization, extracted the surviving research samples, and quietly handed them to the Threnbell government before anyone in committee had finished arguing about liability. None of this was secret. It was simply beneath notice. The Council was old, its institutions built by species who had been managing galactic affairs since before humanity had invented writing, and old institutions develop a particular kind of blindness. They stop seeing the people who do the unglamorous work, because unglamorous work has never, in their long memory, been the kind of work that matters. They were about to learn otherwise. The first sign of trouble reached Vithiron's desk 6 days after the withdrawal notice, filed not as a diplomatic incident, but as a logistics complaint, which was why it took another 2 days to reach anyone with the authority to be alarmed. The complaint came from the Agricultural Collective on Doiran's Reach, a mid-sized colony 3 jumps from the nearest council waypoint, and it was short and increasingly unhinged. The collective's entire seasonal grain shipment, 11 months of surplus, contracted for delivery to 4 separate systems, had failed to depart. The freight company responsible, listed in the paperwork as Keswick Long Haul Consolidated, was not answering hails. Its office on Doiran's Reach was locked. Its ships, according to the tracking beacons, had simply stopped moving, parked in high orbit like abandoned toys. Vithiron pulled the ownership records out of habit more than concern, expecting to find some minor local operator who'd gone bankrupt or been bought out. Keswick Long Haul Consolidated was a human company. 90% of its ships were, in fact, humanity ships, not because the Council had granted them exclusive rights, but because nobody else had bothered to bid on expanse routes that took 4 months one way and paid barely above cost. She pulled up the wider shipping registry, and for the first time in her career, actually looked at what percentage of expanse route cargo tonnage moved on human register hulls. It was 31%. She sat with that number for a long moment, the way you sit with a number that doesn't seem like it can possibly be true, and yet has clearly come from a real database. Then she pulled the crew manifests for every idle ship in the Doiran's Reach system. Every single one was human. Every single one was gone. Not fired, not reassigned, simply not aboard. The ships sat empty in orbit, their reactors banked to standby, their cargo holds full of grain that was going nowhere. She sent an inquiry to the Council's General Communications Relay. The address every client and member species was required by treaty to keep monitored around the clock. It bounced. Not undeliverable. She could see the message had been received, but no acknowledgement came back, no auto-reply, nothing. It was the silence of someone who had heard you perfectly well and simply had nothing further to say. She tried a second channel, and then a third, working her way down a list of contact addresses that had always, in the past, produced at least a polite acknowledgement within the hour. All 3 went the same way, received and left alone, like letters dropped through a mail slot into an empty house. The Corvain belt call came in 9 days after the notice, on a Tuesday that started, for the 2-person crew of the survey vessel Halcyon Draft, like any other. They were mapping debris density along the belt's inner edge, a contract job for a mining consortium, when a fuel line ruptured on the aft manifold and took out 2/3 of their power systems in the same cascading failure. It was not by itself a catastrophic problem. The Halcyon Draft carried standard distress beacons, and the region fell within the operational radius of Rim Medical Relay Station 4, a modest facility that had, for the past 6 years, maintained an average emergency response time of under 90 minutes. The beacon went out automatically the moment the ship's systems registered critical failure. It was received, the log would later confirm this, by Relay 4's automated intake system, which logged the distress call, assigned it a priority flag, and waited for a human dispatcher to review and launch the rescue craft, exactly as it had been designed to do for 6 years. No dispatcher reviewed it. Relay 4's contracted staff, 3 technicians and a flight controller, had resigned as a unit 8 days earlier, in the same wave that had emptied Rim Station 9 and a dozen posts like it, and nobody had yet been assigned to replace them. The station itself sat fully powered, fully functional, entirely capable of launching a rescue, and utterly unmanned. Aboard the Halcyon Draft, the 2-person crew did what people in that situation do. They rationed air, they attempted repairs with what remained of their tools, and they waited, checking the beacon status every 20 minutes, watching it register received, and then nothing further, for 11 hours, until a member species border patrol on an unrelated route happened to catch the beacon on a routine long-range sweep and diverted to investigate. They found one survivor. The ship's pilot, Ira Wren, had used the last of the emergency oxygen reserve to keep her engineer alive as long as she could, and had not managed to keep enough for both of them. She would tell the story later to exactly one council investigator, in a flat and exhausted voice, and would ask only one question in return: whether anyone had actually been listening on the other end, or whether the beacon had simply been shouting into an empty room the entire time. The investigator did not have a comfortable answer for her. By the second week, the grain problem had become a pattern, and the pattern had a shape that made Vithiren's stomach hurt to look at. By the second week, the grain problem had become a pattern, and the pattern had a shape that made Vithiren's stomach hurt to look at. It wasn't just shipping. The Frontier Medical Relay Network, a chain of small emergency stations along the rim that provided the only rescue capability for ships in trouble more than a day from a proper starport, had gone dark almost overnight, station by station, as their contracted staff simply stopped reporting. A distress call from a damaged survey vessel near the Corvain Belt went unanswered for 11 hours before a member species patrol happened across it by chance. 2 of the 4 crew aboard did not survive the wait. The listening posts along the rim, the ones that had spent decades doing nothing more exciting than logging background chatter and the occasional pirate transmission, stopped transmitting their routine status pings entirely, and nobody council side had the expertise or clearance to fly out and check on them, because the postings had always been staffed by contractors, and the contractors had always been human, and nobody had ever bothered to cross-train anyone else. Vithiren started keeping a private list. She told herself it was for the eventual committee report. In truth, she kept it because writing things down was the only way she could process how much of it there was, and because every time she found a new entry, some small stubborn part of her still expected the pattern to break, to find at least one system where the gap left behind was small and someone else had already quietly stepped in to fill it. It never did, and no one ever had. Waste reclamation on 3 rim colonies, run at a loss by a human cooperative because the alternative was letting the colonies drown in their own refuse. Gone. A terraforming labor contract on New Haver, unglamorous atmospheric seeding work that took decades to show results, and that no other species wanted to commit generational effort to. Gone. The seeding stations left running on automated skeleton programs that would drift out of calibration within a year. A translation and cultural liaison service that the Council had quietly relied on for 2 decades to manage disputes between newly contacted species who didn't yet have compatible legal frameworks. Gone, its entire staff having resigned by group letter on the same day the withdrawal notice went out, a letter Vithiren found, when she finally located it buried in an unread folder that had apparently been sitting unopened for 6 days because nobody senior enough to care had thought a resignation letter from client species, contractors merited priority reading. The translation and liaison service turned out to matter faster than she expected. 9 days after the withdrawal, a border dispute flared between 2 recently contacted species, the Overth and the Khaleesi block, over a shared asteroid mining claim neither side's legal framework had a category for. In previous years, a joint human-staffed liaison team would have been dispatched within hours, fluent in both frameworks and trusted, for reasons nobody had ever bothered to articulate, by both sides equally. This time, the Council's own legal office spent 4 days simply arguing about whose department the dispute technically belonged to, while an Overth mining vessel and a Khaleesi patrol sat facing each other in real space, weapon systems on standby, waiting for anyone, to tell them what to do. It resolved without violence, in the end, mostly by luck and the personal intervention of a retired Khaleesi negotiator who happened to be visiting family nearby. Vathyron added it to her list anyway, because luck was not a policy, and she had started to suspect the Council had been quietly running on borrowed luck for longer than anyone wanted to admit. She began to understand, with a particular dread of someone realizing a structural flaw in a building they live in, that humanity had not been a minor client species doing minor client species things at the edges of galactic society. Humanity had been holding up an enormous, invisible portion of the load-bearing infrastructure that the rest of the galaxy quietly depended on and had never once had to think about, precisely because it had never failed before. And now it had all been switched off at once, on purpose, by people who had apparently decided, quietly and without asking permission, that they no longer wanted the job. The emergency session convened 9 days after the withdrawal notice, in a chamber that had not seen an emergency session in over a decade. Vathyron presented her findings to a room that started out skeptical and ended in something closer to controlled panic. "This is absurd," said Councillor Prenishallo of the Ostren Compact, 3 seats down, a full voting member species, and one who had never in his long career had reason to think about humans at all except as a mildly diverting curiosity at diplomatic functions. "You are telling us that a client species, was responsible for 1/3 of Expanse cargo capacity, our entire rim rescue infrastructure, and apparently half our early warning network, and none of us noticed." "I am telling you exactly that," Vathyron said. "I'm also telling you it gets worse." She brought up the listening post data. This was the part that turned the room quiet. The rim listening posts had never been considered important. They had been established over a century earlier, back when a joint council survey had detected faint, unexplained transit signatures moving along the galaxy's outer edge, patterns that didn't match any known species, didn't respond to hails, and didn't repeat on any schedule anyone could predict. The survey team's official conclusion had been inconclusive, possibly natural phenomena, and the posts had been funded ever since at the barest treaty minimum, more out of institutional inertia than genuine concern. Nobody serious believed there was anything out there. It was the kind of program that existed because canceling it looked worse than funding it badly. Human contractors had staffed nearly every post along the rim for the last 20 years, and in that time, without any instruction to do so, without any funding increase, they had built out an informal cross-referencing system between the posts, comparing notes, flagging anomalies, quietly turning a chain of board monitoring jobs into the closest thing the galaxy had to an actual early warning network for whatever the transit signatures belonged to. That network had gone silent 9 days ago, and in the 4 days since, the transit signatures, the ones the old survey had shrugged off as inconclusive, had started showing up again. Closer, more frequent, moving, for the first time in the historical record, in a pattern that looked less like drift and more like approach. "We don't know what they are," Vathyron said into the silence that followed. "We have never known what they are. The only people who were watching for them have stopped watching. And I would like the record to reflect that I sent 4 separate inquiries to the General Communications Relay this week, and every one of them was received and none of them was answered." Councillor Ishallo, to his credit, did not argue further, though it took him a long moment to get there. He sat back in his chair, arms folded, and looked at the projected casualty figures for a good 10 seconds before speaking again. "I want to be clear about something," he said finally. "I am not accustomed to being wrong about a species' importance by this large margin. I have sat on this subcommittee for 30 years. I have voted on Humanities Status Review 3 times, and 3 times I voted to postpone it because I genuinely believed, that a species without a unified government and a habit of undignified public argument could not possibly be ready for a full seat." He shook his head slowly. "I would like the record to show that I was not being cruel. I was being lazy, and I mistook my own lack of curiosity for sound judgment, and I do not intend to make that mistake a second time. He looked at Vithiren. Then how do we reach them? A younger counselor near the back of the chamber, a Threnbel delegate named Io Maresh, who rarely spoke in full session, raised a hand and was ignored twice before Vithiren finally noticed and yielded the floor to her. I have something, Maresh said, quietly enough that half the chamber leaned forward to hear it. For years ago, during the outbreak on my homeworld, a human retrieval team came without authorization and extracted samples nobody else was willing to touch. I was a junior aide at the time. I wrote them a formal letter of thanks because it seemed like the correct diplomatic gesture, and because my government insisted on it. I never expected a reply. She hesitated. I got one. Not from an agency, not from a government. From the team's medic personally. A short note saying it had been no trouble, and asking, almost as an afterthought, whether Threnbel had ever managed to get its promotion review scheduled with the council, since her sister worked RIM logistics, and had been asking her the same question about humanity's review for years, and neither of them had ever gotten a straight answer. The chamber was very quiet. I still have the address, Maresh said. I don't know if it still works, but it's something. It took another full day to confirm the address still worked and to trace it forward through 2 more informal contacts before Vithiren finally had something that wasn't official, wasn't a council channel, and was, she realized, with a mixture of relief and something like embarrassment, the equivalent of finding someone's home number written on the back of an old business card. She sent the message herself, off any official record, because she had stopped trusting the official record to reach anyone at all. The reply took 6 days, and when it came, it was not from a diplomat. It came from a woman named Priya Achterberg, who identified herself, without further explanation, as coordination for now, and who agreed to a meeting at a neutral waypoint station on the condition that the council send exactly one representative and no security escort. Vithiren volunteered before anyone else could suggest sending someone with more seniority and less understanding of what was actually at stake. The waypoint station was small, mostly unstaffed, the kind of place ships refueled at, and nobody lingered. Achterberg was already there when Vithiren arrived, an unremarkable woman in unremarkable clothes, sitting at a table with a data slate and a cup of something that smelled bitter and human, and Vithiren found herself unexpectedly nervous in a way that surprised her, because this was, on paper, a conversation with a representative of a species the council still officially ranked below full membership. You came fast, Achterberg said, by way of greeting. Faster than I expected, honestly. We figured it'd take you another month or so to notice the shipping numbers, and another 2 after that to connect it to anything that actually scared you. The listening posts, Vithiren said. There didn't seem to be any point pretending otherwise. The signatures are moving. We know. We've known for about 6 weeks, actually, noticed the pattern shift before we pulled the staff, not after. It's part of why the timing wasn't an accident. Achterberg said this the way someone reports a weather forecast, and Vithiren felt something cold settle in her chest. You withdrew your monitoring network, while knowing an unidentified and possibly hostile presence was increasing activity along the rim. We withdrew everything, Achterberg corrected, not unkindly. The monitoring was part of everything. It wasn't personal to the rim posts, and it wasn't a threat, whatever it might look like from where you're sitting. We didn't leave to punish you. We left because we did the math on what 41 years of this relationship actually looked like, laid it all out on a table, and none of US could find a single good reason to keep doing it. People are dying, Vithiren said, more sharply than she intended. The rescue relay went dark and 2 crew members died waiting for help that never came. That's not an abstraction. That's not a line item. Something in Achterberg's face changed at that, not guilt exactly, but a flicker of the same weight Vithiren had been carrying for 2 weeks. That's not nothing to us either, she said quietly. We're not proud of the 2 weeks it's taken. That wasn't the plan. We expected the transition to be cleaner, and it wasn't. But I want to be honest with you about something, because I think you've earned honesty by coming out here yourself instead of sending a committee. We ran the numbers for years before we sent that notice. Every year, humanity subsidized somewhere around 200 systems worth of infrastructure the council took entirely for granted, at a net loss to us, doing the jobs nobody else wanted for a client species ranking that gave us no vote and no protection, and frankly no respect. And every single time we raised it, formally, through channels, the way you're supposed to, we got told to be patient. That promotion review would come eventually. That the process took time. 41 years, and every review board found a reason to push it another decade. Vithyrin opened her mouth to defend the process, and found she didn't actually have a defense ready. She thought of the resignation letter that had sat unread in a folder for 6 days. She thought of the withdrawal notice itself, filed correctly, through the correct channel, and nearly discarded as administrative clutter. "So you left," she said instead. "So we left," Achterberg agreed. "Quietly, all at once, the way we do most things you never noticed us doing in the first place." The next question was the only one that mattered, and Vithyrin asked it plainly, because there was no more time for anything else. "What do we do about the rim?" Achterberg was quiet for a moment, turning her cup slowly on the table. "That's not really my call to make alone, but I can tell you what I think, if you want it." "I want it. I think you have two problems, and you're currently treating them like one. Problem one is that something's moving along your border, and you have no idea what it is, because the only people who are watching it left. Problem two is that you built an entire section of your civilization on labor you never valued, never protected, and never planned to actually promote, and you're only upset about it now, because the bill finally came due." She let that sit for a second. Fixing problem one is urgent. Fixing problem two is the only way problem one doesn't happen again in 20 years with somebody else. "You're saying you won't come back. I'm saying it isn't up to me, and it shouldn't be up to any one person, human or otherwise. But I'll tell you what I do know. Nobody I've talked to wants to watch people die over a rescue relay we used to run for spare change. That's not who we want to be, whatever else is true about this. So there's a proposal on the table, has been for about a week, actually, sitting in the same relay address you kept sending your inquiries to and not getting an answer from. Because frankly nobody was checking it, same as apparently nobody on your end was checking ours." Vithyrin felt something between hope and humiliation. "What's the proposal?" "Full membership review. Not another promise of eventual review. An actual vote on an actual timeline, with actual consequences if it stalls again. Compensation backdated for services rendered at rates that were never fair to begin with. And a joint monitoring authority for the RIM network, built properly this time, cross-trained, funded like it matters, instead of staffed by whoever's desperate enough to take the posting nobody else wants." Achterberg finally looked up. "That's the floor. Not the ceiling. Just the floor." Vithyrin turned that over for a moment. "And if the council votes it down, or waters it into another decade of review, the way they did the last 4 times humanity's status came up, then we stay gone," Achterberg said simply, no heat in it, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. "Not as a threat, as a fact. We didn't leave because we wanted leverage in a negotiation, counselor. We left because we did the actual math, and the math didn't work anymore. If the vote fails, the math still doesn't work, and nothing changes on our end. You'll just be the ones who had the number in front of you and chose not to look at it. People will keep dying on that rim while you decide whether we're worth the risk of coming back. People are dying on that rim because your council spent 4 decades treating a functioning early warning network as a line item too small to matter," Achterberg said. And for the first time there was an edge in her voice, quickly controlled, but unmistakably there. "We didn't build that risk. We covered it for free for 41 years, and the one time we asked to be taken seriously enough to get a vote, we got told to be patient again. I'm not going to sit here and let you hand us the blame for a fire we spent 4 decades quietly keeping out for you." She exhaled, and the edge softened, though it didn't fully disappear. "I'm sorry. That wasn't fair to you personally. You came out here yourself, and that counts for something. But you asked me to be honest, so I'm being honest." Vithyrin didn't argue. There was nothing in the statement she could honestly dispute, and she had spent 3 weeks with the numbers in front of her to prove it. "I'll bring the proposal to the full session myself," she said instead. "Word for word. I won't soften it." "That's all we're asking," Achterberg said. "Somebody willing to actually read the number out loud." They sat a while longer without speaking, the waypoint station humming quietly around them, and Vithyrin found herself studying the woman across the table. The plain clothes, the tired eyes, the total absence of any of the performance she'd have expected from a species making its opening move in the highest-stakes negotiation of its short galactic history. It occurred to her, not for the first time that week, that the Council had spent 41 years measuring humanity by the wrong instrument entirely, looking for grandeur and unity and finding neither, and never once thinking to check for the much quieter thing that had been there the whole time. A species that simply kept showing up to the unglamorous jobs year after year, long after any reasonable people would have stopped. For what it's worth, Vathiran said, standing to leave, the withdrawal notice. 3 lines, no signature, but a registry code. I laughed when I read it. I heard, Achterberg said, and this time she did smile just slightly. My grandmother used to say, the quiet ones only get loud once, and by then it's usually too late to matter. Figured we'd try to beat the deadline this time. You nearly didn't, Vathiran admitted. No, Achterberg agreed. We nearly didn't. It took the Council 11 more days to vote, which by Council standards was practically instantaneous, and which Vathiran spent almost entirely awake, coordinating an emergency stopgap relay staffed by hastily reassigned personnel from 4 member species who had never run a listening post in their lives and who kept, in the log reports she reviewed each morning, missing the same subtle signal patterns the human contractors had apparently caught by instinct. The transit signatures kept moving closer. Nobody figured out what they were, not in those 11 days and not for a long while after, though the shape of the pattern, probing, testing, retreating when it met resolved and organized watchfulness, pressing forward when it met gaps, told Vathiran everything she needed to know about why the old survey team's shrug of inconclusive had been, in hindsight, a catastrophic failure of imagination. The vote passed. Not comfortably, Ashalos faction argued for another delay, another review cycle, right up until Vathiran stood and read the casualty report from the Corvain Belt Rescue Call into the record slowly, including both names, and the chamber went quiet enough that the delay motion died without a second. On the 7th of those 11 days, Rim Station 9, Dana Okafor's old post, now staffed by a rotating crew of 3 member species technicians who had never worked a listening array in their lives, logged a transit signature passing closer than any recorded reading in the station's history. The junior technician on duty flagged it as equipment error. It matched nothing in the reference database, spiked for 4 seconds on a frequency band the older sensors weren't even calibrated to log properly, and vanished before the automated system finished its confirmation cycle. He noted it, marked it low priority pending review, and went back to the far more familiar business of monitoring for pirate chatter, because that was what the training manual, hastily assembled from 6-day-old documentation, had told him to prioritize. It was not equipment error. Vathiran learned this only later, when a cross-reference against Dana Okafor's 11 years of archived logs, finally pulled and properly read for the first time, showed the exact same frequency signature appearing 41 times over the preceding 2 years, each occurrence closer, and each one, in Okafor's careful private annotations, marked with a level of concern that had climbed steadily and been answered, every single time, with silence from above. Vathiran requested Okafor's contact information through the same back-channel Achterberg had provided. She did not expect a reply. She was mildly astonished to get one within the hour, brief, professional, and utterly without warmth, which she thought, under the circumstances, was more than fair. I'm not doing your job for you for free a second time, the message read. But since people are actually dying now, instead of just theoretically dying eventually, check the harmonic drift on the older array calibration. Your new people are reading raw signal, not the corrected profile. That's why they're calling real detections equipment error. I logged the correction procedure in the station manual 11 years ago. It's still there. Somebody just has to open the file. Someone did. The correction cut the stopgap crew's false negative rate by more than half within 2 days, and Vathiran found herself in the middle of an unfolding crisis, quietly grateful to a woman who had every reason in the world not to help, and had done it anyway, briefly, grudgingly, and without asking for anything in return. 3 months later, Vathiran OSS stood on the observation deck of the same small waypoint station, waiting, and found herself unexpectedly moved by how little ceremony humanity brought to the moment. There was no fleet, no formal delegation with an honor guard. A single mid-sized transport docked, unremarkable, The same kind of vessel that had spent decades hauling grain across the expanse for less money than it was worth. And Priya Achterberg walked off it alone, carrying a data slate, and Bathyron noted with something close to fondness, another cup of the same bitter drink. Memberships ratified, Bathyron said, before Achterberg could speak. Full vote, full seat, effective as of this morning. The RIM authorities running joint operations as of last week, still rough, still relearning half of what your people knew instinctively. But it's holding. I heard, Achterberg said. Congratulations. That took actual work on your end, and I know it. It did. Bathyron hesitated, then asked the question she'd been sitting with for 3 months. Why send you? You could have sent anyone once the vote passed. A full delegation. Something with more weight. Achterberg held up the data slate instead of answering directly, and turned it around. It was an invoice. Itemized, precise, covering 41 years. Cargo tonnage moved below cost along the expanse, medical retrieval operations run without authorization or compensation, terraforming labor on New Haver, waste reclamation across 3 RIM colonies, listening post staffing back to the very first contract. The total at the bottom was not small, and it was not, Bathyron noted, remotely padded. Every line matched records. She herself had spent 3 sleepless months pulling and cross-checking. We're not asking you to pay all of it, Achterberg said, before Bathyron could react. Most of us know that's not realistic, and honestly, most of us don't even want it. The point was never the money. But I wanted you to see the number. All of it, in one place, the way we've had it sitting, in one place for years, because somebody had to actually count. Bathyron looked at the total for a long moment, and then at Achterberg, and asked the only thing left worth asking. Have you learned anything? Achterberg's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. That's supposed to be my question. I'm asking anyway. Fair enough. Achterberg set the slate down on the rail between them, facing out toward the dark. We learned that quiet work doesn't get noticed until it stops. We already knew that. Actually, most of us grew up watching it happen at a much smaller scale, long before any of this. What we didn't know was whether leaving would actually change anything, or whether we'd just be replaced by the next species desperate enough to take the job nobody else wants, at the same rate, with the same excuses. She looked at Bathyron directly. So, has the council learned anything? Bathyron thought about the resignation letter that sat unread for 6 days. She thought about 31% of expanse tonnage, and 2 names read into a record in a silent chamber, and 11 days that had felt, at the time, unbearably long, and that she now understood had been humanity's patience running out over 4 decades, compressed into something the council could finally not ignore. I think we're about to find out, she said. Together, this time. If you'll have us. Achterberg picked the invoice back up, folded it once, and tucked away, not thrown out, Bathyron noticed, just filed. The way you keep a receipt for something you hope you'll never need to produce again. We'll have you, she said. But we're keeping the invoice on file, just in case anyone forgets a second time. Behind them, out past the waypoint's long silent arc, the RIM listening post hummed quietly back to life, watched now, by human and council eyes together. And for the first time in 3 months, nobody was asking what might be moving out there unseen. Bathyron walked Achterberg back toward the docking bay, past the observation windows, and found herself asking one more question before they parted. The kind of question that had been sitting under everything else for 3 months, and had never quite found a moment small enough to fit through. Dana Okafor, she said. The technician from RIM Station 9. Is she coming back? Achterberg's expression didn't change much, but something in it settled. The way a held breath finally lets go. Offer her the post back under the new Joint Authority contract. Full member tier pay this time, proper backup staff, actual authority to escalate a flag signal without waiting 6 days for someone to open a folder. She shrugged. She hasn't said yes yet. Says she wants to see if the correction stays open past the first year before she trusts it with another decade of her life. That's fair, Bathyron said and meant it. It is, Achterberg agreed. You'll have to earn that one the slow way, same as the rest of it. She stepped through the docking hatch, then paused, looking back once. For what it's worth, most of us didn't want to disappear. We just didn't see any other way to get anyone to actually look up from the paperwork. I'm glad it didn't have to stay that way." "So am I," Vatharan said, and watched the hatch close, and stood alone on the observation deck a while longer, listening to the quiet hum of a rim that was, for once, being watched by someone who intended to keep looking.